romance, love. These are what we stay alive for. Words and ideas can change the world.
Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, classmates. We are the group 4. The report that assigned to our group is all about literature. So, what is literature? The term literature is used to describe both spoken and written content. Literature, which derives from the Latin term for writing created with letters and means writing produced with letters, is often used to describe works of the imagination such as poetry, theater, fiction, non-fiction, and in some cases, journalism and song. I will give example about poetry. The best example of poetry is Homer's The Odyssey. It is one of the oldest and most famous epic poems. The next one, we have theater. Theater includes performance of plays and musical theater. Theater and use many conventions such as acting, costume, and staging. Fiction and non-fiction. In general, fiction refers to plot, settings, and characters created from imagination, while non-fiction refers to factual stories focused on actual events and people. Journalism. The best example of journalism is the newspaper. Why literature is important? The literature is important because it serves as a type of template for human society. Okay, let's produce of elements of literature. So we have 7 elements. First, we have language. Speaking broadly, this refers to the language a book is written in. Second, mood. The mood of piece is literature refers to the general feelings and emotions that the writer seeks to invoke. Third, plot. The plot of work is the sequence of events that occur in a story. So we have elements of plot. Those are exposition. This is the introduction of the story. Conflict. The conflict of the story serves as the focus and driving force of most of the story's action. Rising action. The rising action of the narrative begins at the end of the exposition. It usually forms most of the plot begins with an inciting and incidents that starts a series of cause and effects events. Climax. After introducing the problem or central conflict of the story, the action rises as the drama unfolds in a series of causes and effects. Falling action. This part of the narrative comprises the events that happen after the climax. Things begin to slow down and work their way towards the story's end, tying up loose ends on the way. Resolution. This is the final part of the plot arc and represents the closing of the conflict and the return of normality in the wake of the history's events. Fourth, we have setting. The setting is simplified the place and time period where a story occurs. Setting consists of 2 key elements, space and time. Space refers to the where of the story, most often the geographical location where the action of the story take place. Time refers to the when of the story. This could be historical period, the present, or the future. 5. Point of view. This is the narrator's perspective on the story. There are various advantages and disadvantages to the different points of view available for the writer, but they can all be usefully categorized according to the whether they are first person, second person, or third person point of view. First person protagonist. This is when the story's main character relates that actions firsthand or he or she experience it. Second person. This is perspective is uncommon. You can recognize this perspective by using the second person pronoun you. Third person. From this perspective, we see events unfold from the point of view of one person in the story. Number 6. Theme. The theme is the central message that author wishes to convey. I will give example. Love, revenge, justice, betrayal, jealousy, and forgiveness. Number 7. Characters. All literary works have at least one character. Okay guys, now let's look at some of the most important of these. Protagonist. The protagonist, the story main character. The story's plot centers around these characters who are usually sympathetic and likable to the reader. That is, they are most often the hero of the story. Antagonist. The antagonist is the bad guy or girl of the piece. Most of the plot's action is born of the conflict between the protagonist and the antagonist. Plot character. Plot characters are one-dimensional characters that are purely functional in the story. Rounded character. Unlike plot characters, rounded characters are more complex and drawn in more detail by the writer, as well as being described in comprehensive physical detail. We will gain an insight into the characters' interior life, their hopes, fears, dreams, desire, etc.
History, timeline, and evaluations. American literature, the body of literature created in the English language in the United States. The history of the nation that generated it. America influenced American literature, as it did other national literatures. America was only a collection of colonies for about a century and a half, strung along the eastern seaboard of the North American continent, from which a few hardy men made courageous forays towards the west. Following a victorious uprising against the motherland, America was transformed into the United States, a country by the turn of the 20th century. This country had spread north to the 49th parallel, south of the Gulf of Mexico, and west to the Pacific. It had established itself as one of the world's powers by the end of the 19th century, and because of how closely it is, would get involved in both of the world wars as well as the issue that Europe and East Asia faced in the years that followed. Meanwhile, numerous changes in people's lives were brought about by the development of science and industry, as well as shifts in thinking and feeling. That the literature of the United States was influenced by all of these developments in the nation. First, the colonial and early national period, 7th century to 1830. The earliest European settler in North America began to record their experience in writing. This was original American lettering, which was clear, practical, frequently influenced by British writing, and future-oriented. Second, the Romantic period. Romanticism is a way of thinking that prioritizes the individual over the collective, the subjective over the impersonal, and the emotional experience of personal over logic. In addition, it favors natural chaos about artificial order. Western European writers adopted Romanticism as their worldview in the late 18th century, while American writers adopted it in the early 19th century. Realism and Naturalism, 1870–1910. More than 2 to 3 million soldiers participated in civil war in the United States, and up to 851,000 people may have perished between 1861 and 1865, Walt Whitman predicted that a great literature will rise out of the epoch of those 4 years. Uh-huh. The next one is Modern Period, 1910 to 1945. At the beginning of the 20th century, scientific and technological development in Western nations accelerated quickly, creating an impression of unheard of progress. There was a great deal of suffering in both Europe and United States as a result of World War I, damage, and the Great Depression. Modernism, a movement in the arts that defined first and foremost as fundamental departure from past, is life with this conflict and tendencies. Mhm. The next one, the contemporary period, 1945 to present. The United States started the Cold War in the late 1940s. After coming out of World War II confident and economically power, the proxy wars and threat of nuclear annihilation that came to define this conflict with the Soviet Union were just two factors that influenced American literature in the second half of the 20th century. Asian literature is varied in that display a range of themes and literary styles, but as it has developed, similarities in the and themes and literary style of the works from different parts of the Asian continent have been found. Mhm. First, Chinese literature, Japanese literature, and Indian literature. The last one is Asian literature now.
Persian literature differs from the common definition of literature in that it is not confined to lyrical compositions, to poetry or imaginative prose, because the central elements of this appear to greater or lesser degrees in all the written works of the Persians. The first evidence of Persian literature is usually dated to 522 BCE with the creation of the Behistun inscription of Darius I. But at the same time, scholars generally agree that there is no Persian literature prior to the period of the Sasanian Empire, 224 to 651 CE, because earlier works, except for certain inscriptions and administration records, were lost. Alexander the Great destroyed the library at Persepolis, 330 BCE, and other works, not inscribed on baked clay tablets, were lost in later times of upheaval and conquest. Persian literature is therefore commonly dated from 750 CE with the rise of Abbasid dynasty through the 15th century CE and earlier works. For the most part, can therefore only be referred to as ancient in that many medieval poets preserved stories and themes from pre-Islamic Iran. English literature, the body of written works produced in the English language by inhabitants of the British Isles from the 7th century to the present day. The major literatures written in English outside the British Isles are treated separately under American literature, Australian literature, Canadian literature, and New Zealand literature. Timeline and evolution of English literature. Old English, 450 to 1066. Old English refers to the literature produced from the invasion of Celtic England by Germanic tribes in the first half of the 5th century till the conquest of England in 1066 by William Conqueror. Old English period written literature began to develop from oral tradition, and in the 8th century poetry written in vernacular Anglo-Saxon appeared. Old English was characterized by epic heroic stories of violence and feudal loyalty, often written in alliterative verse. Next, Middle English, 1066 to 1500s. The Middle English period consists of the literature produced in the 4.5 centuries between the Norman conquest of 1066 and about 1500s, when the standard literary language derived from the dialect of London area became recognizable as modern English. Prior to the second half of the 14th century, vernacular literature consisted primarily of religious writings. The second half of the 14th century produced the first great age of secular literature. Next, the Renaissance, 1500 to 1660. The English Renaissance began with the ascent of the House of Tudor to the English throne in 1485. The English literary Renaissance began with the English humanists such as Sir Thomas More and Sir Thomas White. Next, Neoclassical period, 1660 to 1785. The Neoclassical period of English was influenced by contemporary French literature, which was in the midst of English's greatest age. This literature is known for use of philosophy, reason, skepticism, wit, and refinement. The Neoclassical period marks the first great age of English literary criticism. Next, the Romantic period, 1785 to 1830. The Romantic period of English literature began in the late 18th century and lasted until about 1832. In a nutshell, Romantic literature is characterized by its personal nature, its strong use of feeling, its abundant use of symbolism and exploration of nature and the supernatural. The Romantics were considered innovative based on their belief that literature could be spontaneous, imaginative, personal, and free. Next, the Victorian period, 1832 to 1901. The Victorian period of literature begins with the accession of Queen Victoria onto the throne in 1837 and lasted till her death. As the Victorian period is 6 decades long, 1870 is often used to split it into early Victorian and late Victorian. Overall, Victorian literature deals with the issues and problems of the day. Some of them, contemporary issues, include social, economic, religious, and intellectual issues and problems surrounding the Industrial Revolution. Growing class tensions, the early feminist movement pressures towards political and social reform, and the impact of Charles Darwin's theory of evolution on philosophy and religion. Next, the Edwardian period, 1901 to 1914. The Edwardian period is named after the King Edward VII and spans from Queen Victoria's death till the beginning of World War I. During this time, the British Empire was at its height and lived lives of materialistic luxury. However, despite these 4/5 of the population lived in the squalor, the writings from the Edwardian period reflect deeply on this social condition. For example, some authors attack the selfishness of the upper class. Next, the Georgian period, 1910 to 1936. The Georgian period refers to the period of British literature that is named after the reign of George V. Many writers in the Edwardian period continued to write in the Georgian period. This period produced a lot of poetry by the Georgian poets. Their poetry tended to focus on rural subject matter and its traditional shape and form. Next, the modern period, 1914 to 1945. The modern period of British literature applies to British literature written since the beginning of World War I. The authors of this period experimented with subject matter, from form and style. They have produced achievements in all literary genres. Postmodern, 1945 until now. After, after World War II, the postmodern of British literature developed. Postmodernism blends literary genres and styles and attempts to break free of modernist forms. While the British literary scene at the turn of the new millennium is crowded and varied, the authors still fall into the categories of modernism and postmodernism. However, with the passage of time, the modern era may be recognized and expanded.
Classical period, 5th and 4th centuries BC. True tragedy was created by Aeschylus and continued with Sophocles and Euripides in the second half of the 5th century. Aristophanes, the greatest of the comedic poets, lived on into the 4th century, but the old comedy did not survive the fall of Athens in 404. Established later than tragedy, but preserved more obvious traces of its origin in ritual, for the vigor, wit, and indecency with which it can satirize public issues and prominent persons clearly derived from the ribaldry of Dionysian's festival. Aristophanes' last comedy shows a transition, indicated by the dwindling importance of the chorus toward to the middle comedy, of which no plays are extant. This phase was followed toward the beginning of the 3rd century by the new comedy, introduced by Menander, which turned for its subject to the private fictional world of ordinary people. Later adaptations of new comedy in Latin by Plautus and Terence carried the influence of his work to medieval and modern times. In the 5th century, Pindar, the greatest of the Greek choral lyrists, stood outside the main Ionic Attic stream and embodied in his splendid odes a vision of the world scene, terms of aristocratic values that were already growing obsolete. Greek prose came to maturity in this period. Earlier, writers such as Anaxagoras the philosopher and Protagoras the sophist used the traditional Ionic dialect, as did Herodotus the historian. His successors in history, Thucydides and Xenophon, wrote in Attic. They were preoccupied with ethics, metaphysics, and politics as humankind's highest study, and in the case of Aristotle, extended the range to include physics, natural history, psychology, and literary criticism. They have formed the basis of Western philosophy, and indeed, they determined, for centuries to come, the development of European thought. This was also a golden age for rhetoric and oratory, first taught by Corax and Syracuse in the 5th century. The study of rhetoric and oratory raised questions of truth and morality in arguments, and thus it was of concern to the philosopher as well as to the advocate and the politicians, and was expounded by teachers, among whom Isocrates was outstanding. The orations of Demosthenes, a statesman of 4th century Athens and the most famous of Greek orators, are preeminent for force and power.
Significant works and artists influenced the present time.
Greek literature, body of writings in the Greek language, with a continuous history extending from the first millennium BC to the present day. From the beginning, its writers were Greeks living not only in Greece proper, but also in Asia Minor, the Aegean Islands, and the Magna Graecia. Later, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek became the common language of Eastern Mediterranean lands, and then by the Byzantine Empire. Literature in Greek was produced not only over a much wider area, but also by those whose mother tongue was not Greek. Even before the Turkish conquest, 1453, the area had begun to shrink again, and now it is chiefly confined to Greece and Cyprus. Archaic period to the end of the 6th century BC. The Greeks created poetry before they made use of writing for literary purposes, and from the beginning their poetry was intended to be sung or recited. The art of writing was little known before the 7th century BC. The script used in Crete and Mycenae during the 2nd millennium BC is not known to have been employed for other than administrative purposes, and after the destruction of Mycenaean cities, it was forgotten. Thus, at an early stage, Greek thought was advanced as poetry fashioned their materials. And to this stage of archaic poetry belong to the epics ascribed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, retelling intermingled the history and myth of the Mycenaean age. These two great poems, standing at the beginning of Greek literature, established most of the literary conventions of the epic poem. The deductive poetry of Hesiod was probably later on compositions than Homer's epic, and though different in theme and treatment, continued epic tradition.
Asian literature, Mahabharata by Vyasa. Mahabharata, Sanskrit great epic of the Bharata dynasty, one of the two Indian epic poems written in Sanskrit, the other being the Ramayana. Influence to present time. In our present time, discrimination happens all over the world, and these poems influences people to fight discrimination and disgrace at various stage. He almost became a puppet in the hands of fate. Persian literature, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat is a lyric poem of quatrains, 4-line stanzas. A lyric poetry expresses the poet's intense emotion on themes like life, death, love, and religion, rather than conveying a plot with characters. Influence to present time. The kind of hedonism popularized by the Rubaiyat can help to put us back in touch with the virtues of direct experience in our age of meditation, where so much of daily life is filtered through two-dimensional electronic flickers on a smartphone or tablet. English literature. Beowulf. The author of Beowulf is unknown. 3,182 alliterative lines make up by Beowulf, an Old English epic poem in the style of Germanic heroic tale, one of the most significant and widely translated pieces of Old English literature. Influence to present time. Today, the ongoing conflict between good and evil is still vital. In Beowulf, the Anglo-Saxon battled monsters and other bad creatures. In the modern world, we battled the world's criminals.
Greek literature, body of writings in the Greek language, with a continuous history extending from the first millennium BC to the present day. From the beginning, its writers were Greeks living not only in Greece proper, but also in Asia Minor, the Aegean Islands, and Magna Graecia, Sicily, and southern Italy. Later, after the conquest of Alexander the Great, Greek became the common language of the eastern Mediterranean lands, and then of the Byzantine Empire. Literature is Greek was produced not only over a much wider area, but also by those whose mother tongue was not Greek. Even before the Turkish conquest 1453, the area had begun to shrink again, and now it's chiefly confined to Greece and Cyprus.